Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this RadeonVision video we're going to be discussing and analysing the AMD CES 2019 conference, one of the most hyped and anticipated events in recent memory, at least from my recollection, possibly only matched by the original conferences and announcements of the Zen architecture back in the day. So Lisa Su took to the stage and she brought with her multiple product announcements, plans for the company's future, along with various partners in the industry. A Cliff Notes version, to start us off, we have Phil Spencer all but confirming that the next generation Xboxes will indeed be sticking with AMD. We saw the announcements of the Radeon VIIs, a GPU which is significantly more powerful than the current generation Vega cards, but is using Vega 2 7nm. The leaks that we actually revealed exclusively a while ago, about a week or so ago, were bang on the money here. And we'll go further into that in just a moment. And then lastly, at least from our perspective, primarily as gamers, there was a lot of information concerning Ryzen 3000 and Zen 2. There were some points that were certainly touched on. We had a couple of benchmarks here and there, and we also had some details concerning what AMD were looking to achieve, but as you can imagine, final clock speeds and that type of thing are not disclosed yet. They are still in the engineering stages here. And it looks like those products are not going to launch until the second half of this year, or at least the midpoint of this year. We'll get to that in just a moment. So Lisa Su took to the stage and quickly went through some of the main points of the company, some of the highlights of AMD's past, such as the introduction of x86-64 architectures and the first APUs of the company back in 2013. It was obviously just to get everyone hyped and to remind everyone that AMD is all about innovation, which was certainly the key word that was really banged into people's heads throughout the event. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think overall, Lisa Su did have more stage presence than possibly we've seen in the past. I wouldn't be surprised if she's had some coaching there. In fact, rather amusingly, you might also see her dress sense has changed a little bit. It almost reminds me of Jensen Huang, who is, of course, the head honcho over at Nvidia. And for those who don't know, they are actually related, but I'll let you do your own Googling on that. So, as I said, there were a lot of partners that were brought on stage and a lot of discussion from professional gamers, from games developers. Now, before I get into the video proper, I just want to quickly point out that this is my last video here while I'm in the United States. I will be flying back to the UK tomorrow and I will be landing Friday. The reason I'm saying this is because obviously that means video schedules might be a bit over the shop for the next day or so, but I just want to say that at the start of this video just in case people are wondering. But anyway, getting back into the actual announcements. So first things first, we might as well discuss Phil Spencer being on stage. They went through some of the history of the two companies working together and really harked on a lot about the Xbox One X and some of the custom work that AMD were required to do for the processes inside the system to really allow backwards compatibility and to improve the game's performance of, let's say, an Xbox 360 game running on an Xbox One X. Phil then said that they were very much excited to continue their work with AMD, which obviously implies very heavily that AMD will have a hand in the next generation of systems with Microsoft. They also said that they were keen to work with them on the cloud as well. Microsoft are taking a similar approach to the current Xbox One and Xbox One X, where you have a cheaper but less powerful system, but a more expensive, more powerful system with the Xbox Scarlet lineup, as well as a system which supposedly is going to primarily be aimed at streaming. And Phil Spencer, of course, gave very little details of what the specifications of these consoles would be. It's very curious to me what AMD might be providing Microsoft, because there are certainly a lot of options, and of course most of this does depend upon a couple of factors. The first is the price of the systems. The second is the release window, because if you release a console a year later for the same price, you can get considerably better specs. I do believe it's pretty obvious, though, that they're going to be built on 7nm. The rumours are that the PlayStation 5 is going to be Navi-based with a Zen type of processor. There are so many conflicting reports whether it's Zen Plus or Zen 2. So I suspect Microsoft will most likely, at least in the CPU side here, match what Sony are doing, but the core count along with the GPU remains more of a mystery. Navi, as we all know, is supposedly partially funded by Sony, and that means that Sony might be able to refuse Microsoft access to the technology, which could possibly mean that they're going to use Vega, which would make some level of sense, or they could use some entirely different GPU architecture, or they could maybe just take Navi, tweak it a little bit, or maybe Microsoft also partially funded Navi, therefore Sony don't have any right to refuse things. This would be very much like Cell back in the day, where it was a collaborative effort between multiple companies, which did actually end up Sony being slightly screwed, because obviously the CPU cores for Cell did get borrowed for the CPU inside the Xbox 360. So it's going to be interesting to see what the final specs will be of these consoles and what they will be technically capable of doing. Of course, stick with us here at Red Gaming Tech, and I will be covering that more in depth over the next several months when we start hearing further rumours. So, what about the GPU lineup? And what about CPU lineup? Well, let's discuss Vega first, because, oh boy, I'm going to quickly run through the history of what we've got now. We've got the Vega 64 and Vega 56, which closely matches the 1070, 1080 level of performance from Nvidia, but of course, Nvidia have since updated their GPUs. So we've got the RTX 2060, 2070, 2080, and finally 2080 Ti. But those generation of graphics cards are definitely more expensive than Pascal. However, you also do get the ability to run games at RTX and DLSS and so on. So there is an argument to be made whether that's worth it to you, and it's outside the scope of this video. The bottom line is, though, in terms of sheer traditional pixel pushing performance, AMD are behind Nvidia, at least for now. But what AMD do have is cards such as the RX 570, 580 and 590. The 570 in particular was benefiting for some rather steep price cuts over Christmas, which meant that if you're a gamer who wants to play at 1080p or, you know, that type of resolution, maybe up to 1440p, AMD do have a solution for you, and it's at a reasonable price. And you can make arguments all day long what's better value out of, let's say, a 1060 and let's say an RX 590. But of course, everyone is waiting for the next generation of GPUs from AMD, and we have some information concerning that, and it is not Navi based yet anyway. I'll get into more into Navi and what I think is happening with that in just a moment. But first things first, Radeon VII. What about performance? Well, the specifications that I was told very closely match what the final performance and specs of this GPU are. The only thing I was not told was the number of compute units, which is 60. In terms of clock speed then, AMD are advertising the clock up to around 1800 MHz. This is compared to around 1500 MHz with Vega 64, although that did depend upon the model of Vega you're getting, so whether it was air-cooled, water-cooled and so on. The other problem with Vega 64, and this is slightly off topic, is that with Vega 64 you had an obvious issue where the card, the core itself would often be power limited or heat limited, so typically the boost frequency would start to diminish at a much faster rate compared to, let's say, Pascal. And this is combined with a few other concerns, such as a high bandwidth memory too, ironically enough, given there's so much PR around the card at the point aimed at HBM2. HBM2 actually was a limiting factor, with not enough bandwidth even on the 56 model. But according to AMD slides, once again, 60 compute units, not 64. It's possibly then we've seen a cut here as a measure to cost reduce the card compared to the professional models. AMD are advertising the performance of this GPU to be roughly on par with an RTX 2080, plus a few percent, although the titles they were providing us in terms of a comparison were rather limited. But I will say, from what I'm hearing from my sources, a couple of sources, the numbers AMD are giving appear to be roughly on par with a wider gamut of applications. AMD also do tell us that this card is really good for professional level applications, as you can probably imagine, although I will be interested to see how it competes against Turing. As I've showed in a series of benchmarks, you can find that linked in the video description if I remember to link it, which sometimes I don't, but you can still Google Turing versus Pascal on the channel and it will pop up. But either way, Pascal is significantly slower than Turing in professional level applications. So how AMD's Vega 7, or should I say Radeon 7, will fare here in terms of the prosumer market isn't known. Other specifications, we see 16 gigabytes of high bandwidth memory too, along with 1 terabyte per second of memory bandwidth. So that's an awful lot of performance right there. In fact, it's quite interesting because a friend of mine actually provided me a link to a post by the Division 2's official Facebook page. And Ubisoft do actually list the Radeon 7 along with the RTX 2080 Ti. What's even more fascinating is that according to the post we're seeing here, they recommend 11 gigabytes, I'm just going to say that again, 11 gigabytes of VRAM for 4K with all of the graphics settings at their highest. We also saw a limited demo of Devil May Cry 5. The reason I say limited demo is because there is no point of comparison here. We don't really know how demanding overall Devil May Cry 5 is. I mean, we can certainly make some guesses based upon the recommended system requirements that have been released, and we can also make some guesses just overall, but without, let's say, them comparing it with a exact like-for-like run on, let's say, a Vega 64, it's really difficult for us to be like, well, okay, it's this much more powerful. However, AMD are telling us it's around 25 to 35% faster than the older Radeon cards, and I can imagine that this is probably true. The clock speeds alone, along with various tweaks in terms of efficiencies of the architecture, probably would give them those numbers. And as for pricing, then it's going to be costing you $700 US and will launch on the 7th of February, so around a month's time. So it's not too long into the future at all, and should compete rather favourably with the RTX 2080. As for which card's better, no one knows yet, and I would highly recommend that if gaming is your primary focus, wait for the reviews and don't just put a pre-order down. But that's just my personal opinion. So what does this mean for Navi? Because there was no mention at all of any Navi cards. And honestly, it's a bit of a head scratcher, because from my point of view, it's kind of weird because Navi was expected to launch by the late first quarter or early first half of this year, but obviously that's not happening. And it's even stranger because the price point from so many different leaks with Navi was supposedly around the $250 to $300 US mark. The performance of the card was said to be roughly on par with a 1080, although some leaks said a little bit faster, some leaks said a little bit slower. So it's kind of baffling to me, because if AMD do release Vega 7, I keep calling it Vega 7, Radeon 7, at the $600, $700 mark, which is, let's say, 35% faster than Vega 64, AMD then can't release a couple of months into the future Navi, which is $300 US, but let's say Vega 64 plus 10 to 15%. It's possible then that we actually see what PC Games N reported being true, that Navi is going to be a lower end replacement of Polaris, so will essentially sit in the same spot as, let's say, the RX 580 and so on, but with an obvious performance uptick. So that would probably put it more closely in the 1070 to 1080 range in terms of performance, but with a lower price point. Is that true? Is that untrue? No one really knows right now, and AMD have not provided us any insight into Navi. It's all right now about the Vega. And even the logos they showed on stage from the very beginning were Vega based, and all of the APU discussion as well was around Vega. So your guess, unfortunately, is as good as mine when it comes to their plans with Navi. It's possible there's been a delay, it's possible that they're targeting a lower performance section of the market than what some people anticipated, or it's possible that something else is going on. So then, what about the Zen 2 architecture along with Ryzen 3000? Well, the first thing AMD were very keen to show us is a benchmark, yet another benchmark, comparing the Intel 8180 CPUs that's in a dual socket configuration against a single 64-core 128-thread Rome processor. And as you can imagine, since AMD were showing us this demonstration, guess which one won? Indeed, it was AMD. Not by a significant margin, but it did win by a margin. After that, AMD went through some of the technical details they'd already revealed in the past. So 4 times the floating point performance, the fact that you can slap in a Rome 64 core processor into your current EPYC motherboards, and so on and so on. There wasn't anything really new there other than that they were on schedule with the release and it would be taking place by around the first half of this year. While there was no new technical information other than this benchmark, AMD did confirm that the release window of the processor was still on track and we would most likely see it by the second quarter of this year, late second quarter. So then, the obvious thing that follows up from that is, what about Ryzen 3000? Do we hear any news about 16-core processors? What about the clock speed? Nothing. What AMD did show is a couple of games running, including Forza Horizon 4. We saw a couple of other games and tests being conducted. For example, we saw Cinebench, which pitted the 8-core 16-thread Zen 2 powered Ryzen CPU. I'll get more into just the specifications and information about that in just a second, against an i9-9900K. The i9-9900K scored around 2,000 points in Cinebench, whereas AMD's processor, which is still unnamed right now, scored around 2,500 points. Now, for my own personal testing, the 2,000 mark is a little low for an i9-9900K, so it's possible that, you know, the configuration was maybe slightly limiting both systems, assuming it was identical for both. But AMD did say that the final clock speeds yet they are not ready to reveal because they are still, I'm just going to stress that, still engineering samples. In fact, they deliberately hid the clock speeds and all other mention of the processor's specifications, so no information regarding the cache and so on. They just simply revealed it's an 8-core, 16-thread CPU. But if you were to look at the actual die that Lisa Su held on stage, she said that this was the processor naked, basically. You can see that the larger die is the I/O controller, which we all know about. It's responsible for communicating with the memory of the system, PCIe, blah, 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 blah. And you see the smaller die, which is the 8 cores, 8 processor cores. It's pretty bloody obvious to anyone there is space there for another 8-core processor block, another chiplet. Right now, AMD are not showing that. And now it's also possible AMD could use that space for other things. For example, integrated Vega GPU. And some of this discussion I've actually had with the retired engineer who put together quite a lot of system diagrams of what he had been hearing through the industry whispers and so on. I would advise you to check him out. He is on Twitter, so you can search for him. And he had a lot of insight into what AMD might be doing with the chiplet designs. But unfortunately, they are still guesses because obviously he's not working now with the engineering teams at AMD. But he made some best guess scenarios. And to him, he believes that yes, it's possible AMD could go with a 16-core processor, but in terms of clock speeds and stuff, we have to wait because AMD are not revealing that information. If I had to guess, it's possible that AMD are just still trying to figure out internally what the CPUs are capable of, both in terms of clock speed and what they're comfortable with in terms of power consumption. I've also heard from various sources, as a separate source, that the memory support is DDR4 3200 MHz. Officially, obviously, unofficially, you could certainly go higher. PCIe 4.0, my source told me, and yes, that's been confirmed. My source also told me it's USB 3.2. That was confirmed at the time when my source was speaking to me, which was about a month or so ago. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. I was told that AMD had not decided internally whether the Ryzen 3000 series of CPUs would be backward compatible with the X400 for a couple of different reasons, power delivery being one concern, the other one is BIOS sizes and so on. But Lisa Su on stage did confirm that this is not the case, and if you have, let's say, an X370 or X470 board, then by golly gosh, you can take a Ryzen 3000 CPU, plunk it in, and you're good to go. Naturally, that does mean that you don't have PCIe 4.0 though, but whether that's a big deal or not, probably not, at least for now. I do suspect that Radeon VII will be PCIe 4.0 though, because that's what I've been told. One area AMD certainly did win over Intel though from the Cinebench tests was lower power consumption. The 9900K in Intel's tests was around the 170-180 watts drawn, whereas according to what we're seeing with AMD's engineering sample, it was hovering around the 130 watts drawn. Obviously that goes up and down all the time, but that's definitely a benefit from AMD, although this is an 8-core 16-thread processor. If AMD do opt to, let's say, go to 12 cores or 16 cores, we can only guess. And what about Threadripper? Well, no mention, of course, as you can imagine, of the 3rd generation. She did say, though, that by the second half. So what do I think of this? Well, I am slightly disappointed we didn't see more details concerning the Ryzen 3000 series. It's also possible AMD is sandbagging. I would not be surprised if we did see a higher core count variant of the Ryzen 3000 series. AMD might just be waiting either until they're more confident, or they wait and see what Intel will be showing off to the market with its Ice Lake CPUs, because as we've heard, they've got obviously a new architecture there. Supposedly the core count's going to be higher, the clock speed's going to be higher, and so on. AMD also did not show single core performance with the Ryzen 3000 series CPU that was being tested here, only multi-core performance, so we still don't know how it compares. It's possible though that it is because AMD have not nailed the clock speed yet, and so they don't feel it's a fair comparison, but as usual, all we can do here is wait and see. So, what do I think? Overall, I'm pretty happy with AMD's CES 2019 conference. There are still a lot of questions that we've got, and unfortunately, only time can answer what those questions are. But normal stuff, if you've enjoyed the video, you can certainly like and share this video, which would help us out immeasurably. You can comment down below as well what you're expecting from AMD. And there's also a Patreon link, which you can find in the video description, along with, of course, an Amazon affiliate link. So once again, if you want to buy some bubblegum or something like that, then by all means feel free. With all that said, take care of yourselves.